The rotten truth about prison food nobody talks about, hidden secrets inside U.S. prisons. The meal that broke a man. The sound of metal echoed through the cold, gray cafeteria. Clang, clang. A tray hit the floor, splattering something that barely looked like food. The smell was worse than spoiled dog food, sour, burnt, and rotten. Inmate Marcus Hill, a tall man with hollow cheeks and tired eyes, stared down at what was supposed to be his dinner, a lump of brown paste that smelled like mold and chemicals. He took one bite and gagged. Moments later, his stomach twisted violently. He fell off the metal bench, gasping for air, clutching his gut as the guards shouted for him to get up. But Marcus couldn't. Other inmates watched silently. They'd seen it before: food poisoning, bad meat, or something even worse. But this time, something felt different. The guards didn't seem surprised. They just dragged Marcus away like he was trash. And as they carried him through the corridor, one inmate whispered, "They feed us garbage and call it justice." That was the night when the truth started to rot its way to the surface. A truth that nobody outside those walls wanted to hear. What's really inside the food served in America's prisons? And why are inmates being fed meals that could make anyone sick? To answer that, we have to go back to where it all started. Welcome to the kitchen of despair. The prison kitchen at Iron Creek Correctional Facility was nothing like a normal kitchen. The walls were stained yellow from years of grease, the smell of bleach fought with the stench of spoiled meat, and the floor was always wet. Every morning at 4 a.m., inmates working in the kitchen would line up to cook breakfast, though cooking wasn't the right word. They were assembling slop. Marcus Hill, before he collapsed in that cafeteria, used to work here. He'd wake up early, pull on a greasy apron, and join the food prep line. Shovel leftover beans from the night before into a large gray pot. Sometimes, that same pot would be reused for 3 or 4 days straight. When he asked the kitchen supervisor why, the man shrugged. "Budget cuts," he said. "If it ain't crawling, it's good enough." Marcus tried to ignore it. He needed that kitchen job. It gave him an extra sandwich and some time away from the violent cell blocks. But one morning he noticed something odd. The delivery truck that was supposed to bring fresh supplies came late, and when the back doors opened, the air was thick with rot. Boxes of chicken, sweating in the sun for hours, covered in flies. They used it anyway. That day, Marcus couldn't bring himself to eat the lunch he helped make. He quietly watched others swallow it down. The beans, the spoiled meat, the smell, pretending it was normal. He knew something was deeply wrong. But he didn't know how deep the rot went, not yet. The loaf of shame. The worst punishment in Iron Creek wasn't solitary confinement. It was the loaf. The guards called it nutriloaf, a bland brown brick made of mashed vegetables, powdered eggs, oatmeal, and who knows what else. They said it had everything the body needs. But the inmates called it the loaf of shame. It was served to anyone who broke the rules, and it came 3 times a day for up to 2 weeks. No salt, no flavor, no mercy. Marcus remembered the first time he saw it. His cellmate, Darnell, had mouthed off to a guard. The next morning, a cold, colorless slab sat on a tray through the food slot. Darnell sniffed it once and muttered, "This ain't food. This is punishment." After 3 days, he could barely stand. By the 5th day, he started hallucinating. The lack of nutrients, the monotony, it broke people. The loaf wasn't just designed to feed you. It was designed to humiliate you. Marcus began to understand, prison food wasn't just bad. It was a weapon, a silent form of control. Then one day the loaf nearly killed someone. An inmate named Rico found a metal screw baked inside his piece. When he bit into it, blood filled his mouth. He screamed, spitting out chunks of his tooth. The guards said it was an accident. But Marcus started to wonder, were all these accidents really accidents? That question would soon lead to something far darker. The secret supplier. Rumors spread fast in prison. And one rumor whispered through the cell blocks like wildfire. The food supplier's dirty. Marcus didn't believe it at first. Until one night, a guard accidentally left some papers on the kitchen counter. Invoices, receipts, and a name that kept showing up, Blackridge Industries. Marcus didn't recognize it, but one of the older inmates did. "Blackridge," he said. "They used to supply the county jail, till they got caught selling expired food." Marcus couldn't believe it. The same company that got banned was now serving the state prison system? He started keeping notes. Dates, boxes, delivery times. He noticed something even stranger. Sometimes, the food that arrived was stamped, not for human consumption. They were supposed to throw it away. But it always ended up in the kitchen. Marcus knew he was risking his life digging into this. But after seeing men get sick, vomit, and faint during mealtimes, he couldn't stay quiet anymore. So he made a plan to expose it. He just didn't know the price he'd pay for speaking up. The day the food fought back. It happened during dinner. The entire cafeteria was filled with noise, trays clattering, guards shouting, and the echo of laughter that didn't sound real. Marcus sat at the corner table. He watched as a few inmates started coughing, then gagging. Within minutes, 5 of them were on the floor, clutching their stomachs. The guards thought it was a fight at first, until one collapsed too. Panic swept the room. The medical team came running, but it was too late for some. Dozens were hospitalized that night. Later, the prison quietly announced it was food contamination. But Marcus knew what really happened. Spoiled meat, ignored warnings, and years of corruption had finally exploded into chaos. And when he tried to tell his story, he disappeared. The rotten truth. Weeks later, the local news reported that Marcus Hill had been transferred to another facility. No one saw him again. But his notes were found hidden inside a vent behind the prison kitchen. Inside them were photos, receipts, and a statement. They feed us what even animals wouldn't eat. And when we speak, they silence us. After that, the story spread beyond the walls. Families of inmates started demanding answers. State officials denied everything. But deep down, everyone knew the truth had finally surfaced. And that truth was rotten. Because the real punishment in prison wasn't always the cell, or the bars, or the years lost. It was being treated like less than human. Fed like trash. Forgotten by everyone. The business of hunger. While Marcus Hill's story faded from headlines, the system that fed him and millions of other inmates kept running like clockwork. Every year, billions of dollars are spent on prison food contracts. But here's the shocking part. The companies making those meals are often the same ones accused of cutting corners, reusing expired products, and paying inmates less than $1 an hour to cook and serve them. One of those companies, Blackridge Industries, was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind them were layers of subcontractors, lobbyists, and private vendors all fighting for the same thing: profit. In one recorded phone call leaked years later, a procurement manager was heard saying, "If the inmates don't like it, tough. They're not restaurant customers." That single quote summed up everything wrong with the system. To the people running it, prisoners weren't human beings. They were units, statistics on a spreadsheet. Inside Iron Creek, the kitchen was still churning. New inmates filled the spots of the ones who vanished. The recipes never changed. The loaf was still served. And the meat still arrived sweating and brown. But what no one realized yet was that one of the workers inside the kitchen was secretly collecting evidence again. This time, it wasn't Marcus Hill. It was a 23-year-old inmate named Luis Ortega. And he was about to do something no one else had dared to try. The hidden camera. Luis had been watching. He'd seen the same things Marcus saw: spoiled deliveries, insects crawling inside bags of rice, and guards telling him to just scrape off the mold. But Luis had one advantage. His cousin on the outside managed to sneak him a small disposable camera during visitation. He hid it inside a hollowed-out box of cereal he used to store sugar. At night, while everyone else slept, Luis took photos: the rotten vegetables, the leaking meat containers, even the label-marked dog-grade chicken meal, on a crate headed to the kitchen. Each click of the camera felt like a death sentence. He knew if the guards caught him, it wouldn't just mean solitary. It could mean transfer, the same word they used when Marcus vanished. But Luis didn't stop. He believed if people outside saw what they were really eating inside, maybe, just maybe, something would change. After weeks of gathering proof, he finally mailed the camera out, hidden in a shipment of library books meant for the chaplain. It reached his cousin 2 weeks later. And once those photos hit the internet, everything exploded. The outrage. Within days, the images went viral. Photos of trays with green meat, food labeled unfit for humans, and moldy bread flooded social media. Hashtags started trending. Hashtag prison food scandal, hashtag rotten justice, hashtag they eats. News outlets picked it up. Lawyers, activists, even celebrities began speaking out. Everyone wanted to know, how could this happen in America? Under pressure, the Department of Corrections announced an internal investigation. But the press releases said the same thing every time: no immediate danger, isolated incidents, no evidence of systemic abuse. Meanwhile, inside Iron Creek, the backlash was brutal. Luis was dragged out of his cell in the middle of the night. No warning. No words. Other inmates said they saw him once more, handcuffed, bleeding from the mouth, being led down the hall. After that, he was gone. The next morning, guards told everyone he'd been transferred. Just like Marcus. The cover-up. The investigation that followed was more like a performance than justice. Officials came, took photos of the kitchen after it had been cleaned spotless, and interviewed inmates under supervision. Every answer was scripted. Every truth twisted. One worker whispered to a journalist later, "They knew exactly when the cameras were coming. They scrubbed everything that day." But while the cover-up continued, something unexpected happened. A few prison staff, guards, even a kitchen manager, began leaking information anonymously. They sent out copies of emails where higher-ups told them to cut meal budgets by any means necessary. Some even admitted the prison got rebates for every dollar saved on food. So, the cheaper the meal, the higher the profit. That was when the truth became impossible to hide. The taste of power. When the media frenzy finally slowed, the food contracts didn't stop. They simply shifted to new companies. Same system, new names. But what the scandal exposed was something much deeper than spoiled food. It revealed how power tastes. Because for the people who controlled those kitchens, feeding prisoners wasn't about nutrition. It was about control. Control through hunger. Control through humiliation. Control through silence. And even after the public outrage faded, the same cycle continued. New inmates, same meals, same rules. As one former correctional officer later said in an interview, "The food breaks them faster than the bars ever will." The forgotten men. Years later, the story of Marcus Hill and Luis Ortega became whispers in online forums, then footnotes in forgotten articles. But for every Marcus and Luis, there were hundreds more, unseen, unheard, still being fed the same slop under the same fluorescent lights. And somewhere, in some cold cafeteria, another tray hits the floor. Clang. The smell rises. The silence returns. And another man wonders if this is justice, or just a slow way to destroy the soul. The rise of the private prison kitchen. By the early 2000s, prisons across America had started outsourcing everything, from medical care to phone calls. And soon, food followed. Private prison corporations realized something the government didn't. There's money in hunger. When a company wins a contract to feed inmates, it's not just a small job. It can be worth tens of millions of dollars a year. The lower they keep the cost per meal, the more profit they make. At Iron Creek, the daily food budget was $1.07 per inmate. That means breakfast, lunch, and dinner, combined, had to cost less than a bottle of soda. To make that happen, they cut corners. Cheaper ingredients. Smaller portions. Fewer inspections. The corporations behind it sold the idea as cost efficiency. They said it saves taxpayers money. But the truth? They weren't saving money, they were making it. One former food service manager, Angela Bryant, later testified that her supervisors ordered her to mix old meat with new shipments to stretch the protein supply. She was told, "It's not like they can complain to Yelp." Angela was fired for speaking out. But her story opened the door to a much larger question. If the food was this bad, what else were they hiding? The corporate shell game. The deeper journalists dug, the messier it got. One company, North Star Correctional Foods, claimed to serve balanced, high-protein meals. But behind the shiny website and public statements was a network of smaller companies, all owned by the same parent group, registered in tax havens. They moved contracts between shell companies, changing names every few years to dodge lawsuits. Each time a scandal broke out, mold, food poisoning, even maggots in the kitchen, the parent company would end the old contract and sign a new one under a different name. The same people stayed in charge. The same food kept coming. The same sickness kept spreading. Meanwhile, politicians accepted campaign donations from the very same companies running the kitchens. That's when the phrase prison food industry started to mean something darker. Because it wasn't about feeding inmates anymore, it was about feeding profits. And as the money grew, so did the silence. The human cost. Inmate Robert Langley, a diabetic at Iron Creek, filed dozens of complaints. He said the meals they served him were loaded with sugar and starch, no alternatives, no nutrition. One morning, after eating powdered eggs and syrup-covered oatmeal, he collapsed in his cell. His blood sugar was 4 times higher than normal. When the story made it to court, the state argued that prison food meets minimum caloric standards. Minimum. That word would echo in Robert's family's mind for years. They realized that in prison, food wasn't measured in quality. It was measured in calories and control. As one former inmate later said in a documentary interview, "They don't feed you to keep you alive. They feed you just enough not to die." The meal management myth. To defend themselves, private food contractors began promoting something called meal management systems. They bragged about new software that could optimize inmate nutrition while reducing costs. The brochures were full of smiling stock photos, healthy salads, grilled chicken, apples. But in reality, the system wasn't about health. It was about numbers. Each inmate was assigned a caloric target, usually around 2,400 calories per day. But what they didn't say was that most of those calories came from carbs, sugar, and processed filler. Bread, corn syrup, powdered potatoes. Protein was the most expensive item, so it was rationed like gold. The algorithm didn't care about freshness or nutrition. It only cared about cost. So when an inmate like Marcus or Luis complained, they were told, "The computer says you're getting enough to eat." That's the cruelest part of the system. The suffering gets hidden behind numbers that look acceptable on paper. Justice served cold. When families of inmates sued over food contamination, the courtrooms told a predictable story. Judges often ruled that unpleasant food does not constitute cruel and unusual punishment. As long as the meal provided basic sustenance, it was considered legal. But legality doesn't mean humanity. One lawyer put it best. You can follow every rule and still destroy a person's dignity. Behind every lawsuit was a human being, someone like Marcus Hill, Luis Ortega, or Robert Langley, whose only crime was expecting to be treated like a person, not a problem. And while their stories sparked small waves of outrage online, the ocean stayed still. The corporations rebranded. The kitchens kept running. And the trays kept sliding through the food slots. The silence after the bite. Somewhere in the bowels of Iron Creek, a tray drops again. Clang. A new inmate stares at his first meal, gray, cold, tasteless. He hesitates, looks around, then takes a bite. His face twists, not just from disgust, but from realization. He's no longer eating food. He's eating the system. And the system always wins. The global prison food machine. Most people think this problem only exists in America. But what if I told you, the same companies supplying rotten meals to U.S. prisons also serve food in prisons across the UK and Canada? When governments began privatizing correctional facilities, they didn't just hand over the keys, they handed over the kitchens. In the UK, one report found maggots inside a food storage unit at a private prison in Birmingham. In Canada, inmates complained about grey mystery meat and flavored powder meals that looked like pet food. And yet, across all 3 countries, the same names kept appearing on contracts. Aramark, Sodexo, Compass Group. These are billion-dollar corporations that also serve school lunches, hospitals, and military bases. But in prisons, they find their biggest profit margins. Because in a cell, you can't walk away from a bad meal. You have to eat it. That's where the power lies. And that's why the system never really changes. The whistleblower's curse. Every system has cracks, and it's through those cracks that truth tries to escape. Angela Bryant, the former kitchen manager who testified about reused meat, wasn't the only one. Over the years, several insiders came forward. A guard in Ohio leaked photos of food labeled expired. A nutritionist in Canada exposed falsified meal logs that claimed fresh vegetables daily, even though the kitchen hadn't received a single shipment in weeks. But almost every whistleblower faced the same fate. Transfers. Terminations. Threats. The most chilling case came from a contractor in Georgia who anonymously sent a box of documents to a journalist. Inside was an invoice showing that prisons were buying animal feed-grade soy protein and passing it off as beef substitute. When the journalist tried to verify the story, the contractor disappeared. No trace. No response. No further contact. It's as if the system swallowed its own secrets. The prison industrial recipe. When you zoom out far enough, you start to see the full picture, a web that connects prisons, corporations, and politics. This web is known as the prison industrial complex. It's not just about locking people up, it's about profiting from every part of their existence. Phone calls, soap, uniforms, healthcare, and yes, food. Each contract feeds the next, literally. A single inmate can generate thousands of dollars per year for these companies, even as that inmate survives on food that costs pennies. And when that inmate gets sick, the prison medical provider, another private contractor, earns more money treating them. It's a closed loop of suffering, wrapped in paperwork and profit. One activist once said, "In prison, everything's for sale, even your hunger." The forgotten ingredient, humanity. In all the reports, audits, and lawsuits, one thing is always missing: the human story. The world reads about inmate nutrition standards and budget efficiency, but not about the man who hasn't tasted a fresh apple in 10 years. Or the woman in solitary confinement who eats cold beans through a slot in the door. These are people stripped of their voices, reduced to numbers, then to silence. A former inmate named Tyrone Davis described it perfectly in a post-release interview. When you eat the same tasteless thing every day, you stop feeling human. And when you stop feeling human, the world can do anything to you. That's the hidden goal behind prison food, not just to save money, but to erase identity. Because hunger makes you obedient, weakness makes you quiet, and silence is the perfect ingredient for control. The empty promises. After public pressure mounted, several prison systems announced reforms. They promised better oversight, fresh food initiatives, and increased transparency. But a year later, nothing changed. The same companies simply rebranded their operations. New logos, new PR campaigns. They sponsored charity events, launched healthy eating programs for schools, and bought social media ads to clean up their image. Meanwhile, inside those same kitchens, the same spoiled chicken was still being cooked. A former inmate cook described the hypocrisy best. They call it reform. We call it reheated lies. The breaking point. Then came the breaking point. In 2024, at a correctional facility in Louisiana, a wave of food-related illnesses spread through 3 cell blocks overnight. Dozens of inmates were hospitalized. 2 were placed on ventilators. Officials blamed contaminated rice, but leaked documents later showed that the prison had received shipments marked, "Returned to Supplier, unsafe." They used it anyway. For the first time in years, mainstream news outlets began asking real questions. Why are these companies still being awarded contracts? Where's the accountability? And why are the victims always silenced? The outrage grew louder, but for the people still inside, it was just another headline that would fade away. The taste of justice. A small group of families, led by Marcus Hill's sister, started an organization called Human Meals, Human Rights. They gathered testimonies, photos, and letters smuggled from prisons nationwide. Their mission: expose every company that profits from feeding people misery. They released a documentary. It went viral. And for the first time, lawmakers began calling for prison food reform acts. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. But it was something. Because every movement starts with a story, and Marcus Hill's story became the spark. The final bite. In the end, the truth wasn't just about food. It was about what happens when a system forgets that punishment shouldn't mean cruelty. The camera pans over a gray tray, the same kind Marcus once dropped on the cafeteria floor. Now, the food is untouched. The room is silent. A voice echoes. Justice isn't how you treat the free. It's how you treat the forgotten. The screen fades to black. The smell of rot lingers. Not from the food, but from the system itself. The seeds of reform. For the first time in years, the tide began to turn. What started as whispers behind prison walls, Marcus Hill's notes, Luis Ortega's photos, had grown into a national conversation. Activists, journalists, and even some correctional officers joined the call for change. States like California, Michigan, and New York quietly reviewed their food contracts. In 2025, a new proposal emerged. The Inmate Nutrition and Dignity Act. It aimed to set minimum health and safety standards for all prison meals, banning expired ingredients, mandating regular inspections, and requiring that inmate kitchen workers receive food safety training. For once, it seemed like the system might finally listen. But progress never comes easy, especially when profit is at stake. The pushback. The same corporations that had fed prisoners for decades didn't take reform lightly. Lobbyists flooded state legislatures, arguing that higher food standards would raise taxpayer costs. One internal memo leaked from a private food contractor read, "If they raise quality standards, we lose contracts. Our job is to prove that what we serve is good enough." Good enough. Those two words had haunted prisoners for generations. Publicly, these companies released glossy brochures with slogans like, "Fueling rehabilitation with nutrition." But inside the prisons, nothing changed. The same powdered eggs. The same gray meat. The same silence. Reform was beginning to look like just another lie. Voices from the inside. Then came the moment that reignited everything, the letters. Hundreds of handwritten letters began arriving at the offices of Human Meals, Human Rights. They came from inmates in 14 different states, each describing the same story in different words. The smell, the rot, the hunger. One letter from San Quentin read, "We aren't asking for steak. We're asking for food that won't make us sick." Another from a women's prison in Texas said, "The milk's always sour. The bread's green. We eat because we have no choice." These letters were scanned, shared online, and read aloud in court hearings, press conferences, and podcasts. For the first time, the public could hear the people behind the plates. And those voices began to echo across borders. The world watches. When the scandal broke globally, other nations took notice. British and Canadian media started investigating their own prison meal systems, uncovering similar abuses. International watchdogs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch released reports condemning the dehumanizing food conditions in Western prisons. Suddenly, what was once dismissed as just a prison problem became a human rights issue. University students began hosting fundraisers for reform. Documentary filmmakers released exposés on streaming platforms. Social media campaigns flooded timelines with one powerful slogan: "No one deserves to starve in silence." The truth that Marcus and Luis risked everything to expose was finally too loud to ignore. The reckoning. In 2026, after years of pressure, several U.S. states officially ended contracts with major private food suppliers. For the first time, prisons began working directly with local farms and nonprofit kitchens. In one pilot program, inmates grew their own vegetables in garden yards. Fresh lettuce, tomatoes, even herbs. It wasn't much, but it was real food. An old-timer at Iron Creek looked at his tray one morning and said, "Tastes like freedom." But not everyone celebrated. Behind the scenes, the corporations regrouped, waiting for their chance to return, rebranded, renamed, and ready to start the cycle again. Because the business of feeding prisons never truly ends. The ghosts of Iron Creek. Even with reform underway, some memories never left. The halls of Iron Creek still carried the smell of bleach and grease. The cafeteria benches were still cold, dented, and stained by decades of forgotten lives. But every so often, a new inmate would hear the old story about Marcus Hill, who took notes, Luis Ortega, who took photos, and the hundreds who spoke when silence was easier. In those whispers, their legacy lived on. Because while their bodies might have vanished, their courage became the recipe for change. What we learned: prison food was never just about food. It was about power, who has it and who doesn't. It taught us how systems can rot from the inside out when no one's watching. It showed us that cruelty doesn't always come in loud explosions or visible violence. Sometimes, it comes in a spoonful of gray slop served with a smile. And it proved something else, too. That change doesn't start with governments or corporations. It starts with one person brave enough to say, "This isn't right." Marcus Hill said it. Luis Ortega proved it. And the world finally listened. The last meal. The documentary closes with a slow zoom on a stainless steel tray. This time, it's clean. On it sits a simple meal: rice, vegetables, and a piece of bread. The narrator's voice returns, calm but powerful. When a nation decides what kind of food to give its prisoners, it decides what kind of justice it believes in. The camera pans up to show sunlight spilling through the prison window. For once, it doesn't feel like confinement. It feels like hope. And as the screen fades to black, one final message appears. Justice begins when cruelty ends.